I want to talk to you today about one of the most life-changing topics I have heard in my whole life. I may say that a lot. There's a lot of life-changing topics I've heard in my life, but this is certainly one of them. And I want to call it what to do after you have rescued. It occurs to me that there are a lot of lessons. I have heard too many sermons about how to be saved, and I need to know how to be saved, and how to be forgiven, and how to tell someone else I am saved, and how to tell someone else I am forgiven, and how to tell someone else they can be forgiven, and how to tell someone else they can go to heaven when they die, and how I can know I'm going to go to heaven when I die, and how to be rescued. And those are some important truths. But we want to talk today about what happens after that, what to do after we are rescued. So let's spend just a minute reviewing last week's lesson. You would do well as teacher to review last week's lesson on a regular basis. You'll spend an hour developing an idea, and if you can spend 2 or 3 minutes the next week reviewing that idea, you will do about as much good in that 2 or 3 minutes as you did in that hour, and you will really increase learning. You spend a little bit of time reviewing what we said last week. And we told you last week that this is a story. The story of Esther is a story about a man who was executed on a pole. Do you remember who that man is? And you want to ask your people a series of questions. I've told you before that the best teachers are those who tell and test. They do what? They tell and test, all right? And we want to do a little testing. And here is a man who was rescued on a pole, and what was his name? His name was Haman, and he was rescued. He was executed instead of somebody else, and the somebody else was? That's Mordecai, and he was executed on a pole instead of somebody else, so that the wrath of the king, who's the king? We're calling him Xerxes. He actually goes by a couple of different names, but we're going to call him Xerxes in this series, so that the wrath of the king could be turned aside, so that God's people could be saved, so that many other people could come to faith, and so that a day of remembrance would be set up. And it reminds us of the gospel. And the gospel is a story about a man who was executed on a pole in behalf of, instead of somebody else. Who was that somebody else? That somebody else was you. You deserve to be executed on a pole, and so do I. And he was executed on a pole instead of somebody else, to turn the wrath of the king, the wrath of God, away from us, so that we could be saved and many other people come to faith in Christ. And we do a day of remembrance to remember those realities. My question is, what happens next? And I want to look at some different verses that are assigned than what were assigned to us, because it seems to me that these verses highlight what the people were to do after they were rescued. So I'm going to look at Esther 8:15 through 17. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold and purple robe of fine linen, and the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness, and honor. And we want to talk about each one of these words briefly. First, joyous celebration translates one underlying Hebrew word, and that is the word tasal, and it means to be cheerful, to cry aloud. It was used of a horse that was neighing, and you see some other translations here. This graph is generated by Logos Bible software, and it shows how the underlying Hebrew word is translated in other places. In this particular case, in the NIV, although you could use it to do other translations as well. So it was a time of joyous celebration. It was a time of happiness. This word is the word we get our word light from, and it has to do with how you feel when you've been living in darkness and now you're living in light. Sometimes translated mourning, sometimes translated light, and this time translated happiness. It was a time of joyous celebration for his happiness and joy, and our word there is simha, and it means bliss, gladness, joy, mirth, pleasure, etc. Sometimes translated rejoicing, glad, pleasure, and so on and so on. And then it was a time of gladness. And this word translated gladness, joy, mirth, rejoicing. In other places translated gladness and joyful and rejoicing and so on. And lastly, in this verse, it was a time of honor, which has to do with heaviness. It has to do with weightiness. And it's translated that way, sometimes rare and valuable and wealth and so on. The next verse we see, in every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness. Now, we already looked at those underlying Hebrew words. Among the Jews, and then 2 more words, there was feasting and celebrating. Feasting has to do with eating, has to do with the fact that the most natural thing in the world, my wife and I next week will be celebrating our anniversary, and I'm just almost positive we'll go out to dinner, and because it's the most natural thing in the world to go out and eat when you feel like celebrating. What do you do when you celebrate? You eat, and it's why we like to eat so much together. They say where 2 or 3 bad